Yapalingana. Welcome everybody to the 2023 Japananga Errol West lecture, brought to you as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public lecture series. My name is Greg Lehman. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor Aboriginal Leadership here at the University of Tasmania and a proud graduate and postgraduate of this wonderful university. Firstly, I would like to welcome you to the land of the Moanina people. They knew the land of the university's city campus as Nipaluna. This was named by the British as Sullivan's Cove. And here at Sandy Bay, on the Sandy Bay campus, the coastline was called Kriwa, at the base of Kriwelati, that we now know as Mount Nelson. I mention these names as a reminder that Tasmania is a place with a long tradition of Indigenous knowledge and learning of history, biography, astronomy, pharmacology, and many other disciplines that were carried across those 2,000 generations through oral traditions, through dance, song, and ceremony. As we will hear tonight, far from being primitive and transient, as the British expected the cultures of native peoples to be, these oral histories are more resilient than the written knowledge systems that we base our Western culture on today. While written systems, as far as we know, date back only as far as the Sumerians of around 4000 BC, the stories of Tasmanian Aboriginal people, as you'll hear tonight, can be dated to more than 3 or 4 times that age. So in welcoming you tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the Moanina not only as the original owners of the land, but as the keepers of deep knowledge, the deep knowledge of this place that Tasmanian Aboriginal people today take responsibility for valuing and honouring and passing on and sharing with others. It's the deep knowledge of this place that we all call home. So on behalf of the University of Tasmania, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's discussion, the Indigenous University, Can It Now Be Achieved? I'd particularly like to acknowledge members of Aboriginal community and elders who are here with us tonight. Particularly welcome Aboriginal staff from the university, and particularly the Riawana team, some of the students and staff I can see here tonight, and particularly thank our Vice Chancellor, Rufus Black, and the Executive Dean of the College of Arts, Law and Education, Kate Darren Smith, for joining us this evening. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of a couple of members of Errol's big family, Kanina and Karen. Thank you very much for travelling and joining us this evening. The Island of Ideas series began in 2020 as a way of connecting our community and ideas while we were unable to host face-to-face events during COVID. The online program continues in the hope that we can connect Tasmania's community and research to people across regions and into a global network of ideas and emerging issues. Tonight's event is part of the Island of Ideas series, but is one of a continuing series of lectures that was actually commenced in 2015. Since that first Japananga lecture, this series has featured national and internationally respected First Nations scholars, including Graham Hingangroa and Linda Tuiwai Smith, Sana Nakata, and our own Maggie Walter, just to name a few. Tonight's event honours the life and work of the late Japananga Errol West, internationally recognised and honoured and respected poet and scholar. Errol made a significant contribution, not just nationally and internationally, but particularly at this university. He was responsible for bringing Aboriginal studies into our programs. His PhD thesis articulated the Japananga Australian Aboriginal teaching and research paradigm, a paradigm which was based on knowledge entrusted to him by Warlpiri elder Japananga Rex Granitz, offering an understanding of the learning journeys critical to the success of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in Western educational activities. Errol was a leader in what has become a global body of research, unashamedly framed from Indigenous perspectives. It is this legacy of alternative narratives and scholarship that this annual lecture seeks to represent. It also seeks to embody another characteristic of Japananga Errol West, his unstinting intellectual generosity to all he met. So it's particularly appropriate that the subject of tonight's lecture is the possibility of an Indigenous university. I was fortunate enough to be present in the early 1990s when Errol and many other senior Indigenous educational leaders began to debate the subject of Indigenous university, the form it would take, how it would be run, and most importantly, who would be the decision makers. You're about to hear more about this from our guest lecturer this evening. Professor Ian Anderson is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at the University of Tasmania. He is an academic and public servant who has made significant contributions to Indigenous health and education. His extensive background in research, including public health and the social and cultural determinants of health, have enabled him to provide invaluable insights into program and policy developments in these fields. A Palawa man, Professor Anderson was born in Devonport and is deeply connected to his traditional culture and community through his ties to Tebrakuna country in northeastern Tasmania. He has an unwavering dedication to preserving and honouring his heritage, while his non-Aboriginal family are largely of convict descent from across Tasmania. Ian graduated from the University of Melbourne as a medical doctor in 1989 and was later awarded an honorary Doctor of Medicine. He was also awarded his PhD in Sociology and Anthropology in 2006. Ian is currently a public health physician and a member of the Faculty of Public Health Medicine in the Royal Australian College of Physicians. Professor Anderson has been a national policy leader in Indigenous affairs and higher education policy and programs. During his more than 20 years working in higher education, he has promoted access to higher education for Indigenous Australians and for all Australians from regional areas and educationally disadvantaged communities. As a highly respected figure, Professor Anderson has inspired countless individuals and left an indelible mark on Indigenous education and health. His hope is that his legacy will continue to inspire future generations of Indigenous leaders and scholars to follow in his footsteps and continue the critical work of advancing Indigenous education and health in Australia. Please make welcome Professor Ian Anderson.
Thank you, Greg. Ya Palanginia Karati, Mini Ian Anderson, Waipa Parapana, Cho Wallaway, Pamamarna, Tapuchi La Rapana, Numera Natana, Mina Tanapri Palawa, Nini, Manathina Nika, Kunani, Tim Tamali Minani, Nibaluna, Mina Tanapri Palawa, Waranta Takamuna, Milathina Tami Nagini, Raji. Waranta Tanapli Wepa Palawa, Jampanaka, Errol West. Nara Takamuna, Rala. Kani, Rala. Leini, Rala. Hello and welcome, friends. I introduce myself and where I'm from. I acknowledge with respect the old people of the country around where we're meeting. The mountain, the country of Hobart, Nipaluna, Kaningi, the mountain, and the river, Tintamali Minani. Tonight we honour the memory of Japananga Errol West, Waipa Palawa. He opened up educational pathways for his people, and one of his big ideas, which he shared with those early generation of educational activists, was the creation of an Indigenous university. I'd like to welcome and acknowledge all the friends that Greg has also acknowledged. I also want to acknowledge PhD students from La Trobe Universities, my very old friend Julie Andrews, Professor Julie Andrews, who's led the change, the transformation in Indigenous education at La Trobe Universities. Greg neglected to say that my PhD is from La Trobe. I particularly like to welcome my sister, who's come down from Launceston and is a La Trobe University student. So all you folks, I want to feel you're part of my home, and particularly want to acknowledge the contribution that the Yorta Yorta Briggs family has made to education, which I'll refer to a little bit later in the speech. Australian Indigenous education activists such as Errol, Palawa Aunty Patsy Cameron, Kamilaroi man Colin Berg, Otchabalak woman Eleanor Berg, Narangini man Darryl Rigney, Narunga Kana and Narangini man Mr. Irabina, Kamilaroi man Bob Morgan, Palawa woman Kay Price, Gubbi Gubbi and Gungaloo woman Eve Fiesel, Hillis Maris from Yorta Yorta, Birai woman Gracelyn Smallman, Bardi woman Pat Duncan, and Pakala woman Jill Milroy and Daru woman Marianne Bin Salek, and many, many more pushed at educational boundaries to create an educational future for Indigenous Australians. These are revolutionary thinkers, have contributed to the growth of higher education in Australia for over 40 years, not just to the benefit of Indigenous Australians. All Australians have benefited from their scholarship and from their activism. They had a bold vision. Among these ideas was the idea of an Indigenous university. I'm uncertain who actually came up with this idea. Most likely it evolved out of discussion between these cohorts of educational activists. This was not just happening locally here in Australia. International education leaders also created the momentum for change around the transformation of university education. Just in Aotearoa, Maori intellectuals and university leaders such as Graham Hingaroa and Linda Tuwai Smith were also at the forefront. Linda Tuwai went on to global prominence with a seminal work, Decolonising Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People, first published in 1999. She was not the first Indigenous person globally to challenge Eurocentric research practice using academic knowledge. But her publication has had a profound and lasting impact globally and on academic disciplines, both in research and their approach to teaching. Indeed, in 2023, this university's Darug scholar, Jennifer Evans, co-edited a volume of Indigenous Women's Voices, celebrating 20 years of Linda's decolonising methodologies. The leadership and activism of early Indigenous education leaders continues to create change. Government figures indicate that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students commencing a bachelor's degree has more than doubled in Australia since 2008. Nevertheless, 45% of Australians in their 20s have a university degree, compared to 7.4% of Indigenous young people. Clearly, there is more work to be done. This year, the Australian Universities Accord panel are undertaking a generational review of university education. Their interim report recommends, and I quote, First Nations students' culture, knowledge, research and communities should be at the heart of university and higher education. Tonight I want to go back and describe the context in which this bold idea of an Indigenous university first emerged. This takes me back to the university world of the 1980s, actually when I started my university education. I want to describe some of the thinking that's going across this country in the terms of the Accord work around the future of universities, education and research. And I will conclude that at no moment in our global history have we a greater need for universities to embrace the ideas that Uncle Errol West and the other Indigenous educational activists laid out nearly 30 years ago. I will argue that Indigenous Australians are pivotal to transforming universities for all Australians and to create impact on the global challenges in front of us all. But first, let me go back to the 1980s. This isn't part of a personal story. I was born in Devonport. My Palawa family have lived around Latrobe since the early 1850s. Our matriarch, Dalrymple Briggs, was born on the Strait Islands around 1808, baptised in about 1811. She was the daughter of George Briggs and Moritamotta Diana, who had traditional ties to Tebrakana near Cape Portland. Dalrymple survived the brutalities of the Tasmanian genocide to have a large family with the convicts Thomas Baker and Thomas Johnson. Most of my non-Indigenous roots are indeed from convict families in the north. In the world I grew up in, Palawa, like other Indigenous Australians, rarely finished high school, let alone went to university. Margaret Williams Weir, Malera Bunjalung from the northern New South Wales, was the first Aboriginal woman to complete a university qualification from the University of Melbourne in 1959. My educational experience was like a lot of poor white families from the North Coast. My father was a farm labourer. We moved around a lot. I went to 8 different schools, but ended up doing my high school in Bendigo in Victoria. I was extremely fortunate to go to a senior secondary college, which gave me a lot of educational opportunity. I grew up in rural poverty. The work of a rural labourer was hard. Dad worked as a seed cleaner in Clements and Marshalls in Devonport. He did fencing, baled hay, and worked as a station hand. On the other hand, I was more of a book kid. I like science, and I thought I could find a job in health. I decided at the age of 15 I was going to become a doctor. Quite an extraordinary thing when I think about it, and I think my mother just couldn't grasp what it was. In that year, when I told my mother, and she was a little bit concerned that I had set my sights too high, that was the year I couldn't go to the school camp because she couldn't find $60 to send me to the Year 10 camp. So we were in a really dire, in quite a degree of poverty. But there were also no Aboriginal doctors at this time, and there were certainly very few doctors from poor rural labouring backgrounds either. There is a much longer history internationally of Aboriginal folk, Indigenous folk in medicine. Dr. Orantai Teka was the first Mohawk doctor in Canada. He graduated in 1966 from the University of Toronto. The first Maori doctor and Minister for Health was Sir Maori Worimo Paramari, who graduated in 1989 from the Chicago College. Tarangi Haroa, Sir Peter Buck, was also an anthropologist who was the first Maori doctor to graduate in 1904 from the University of Otago in Melbourne, in New Zealand. The first Native American MD was Susan LaFlèche-Picot. She graduated top of her class in the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1989. So when I landed as a first-year medical student at the University of Melbourne, I recall there were about 15 other Aboriginal and Torres Strait students at the university. In the year before I finished Year 12, there were probably only 12 Koori students, Aboriginal and Torres Strait students, who, like me, finished high school that year in Victoria. I did try to apply to the University of Tasmania to do medicine, but I was unfortunately unsuccessful because in those days this university didn't take students from such foreign places as Victoria or Bendigo. This world would change. This educational world would change, and it was largely due to Indigenous leaders such as Japananka Errol West, together with Auntie Patsy Cameron and other members of the National Education Committee. Set up in 1973, the NAEC was chaired by Margaret Palladian, the first Aboriginal woman in Australia to actually graduate with a full degree after Auntie Margaret. The NAC was very focused on developing pathways through school, and in 1982 began to lay the groundwork for the first national Aboriginal education policy. In the 1980s, the initiative to create 1,000 Indigenous teachers by 1990 was announced, and their activism and leadership would go on to transform Indigenous education in Australia. And a number of my Aboriginal colleagues in the room kind of want you to try and pick out who's in this photo. In his doctoral thesis, Japananka Errol West wrote about the possibility of an Indigenous university. He and others accepted that the attainment of Western education was very important for Aboriginal people, but it was also essential to combine Aboriginal cultural knowledge and mores with such education. His model, and I quote, would be dedicated to recognising and promoting Indigenous Australian cultures and enhancing the intellectual and cultural understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. He aimed to increase the participation of Indigenous Australians in university education and collaborative research and development projects. He had at a time a very quite specific proposal of amalgamating all the Indigenous education centres across all universities in a way that probably wouldn't work in our current environment. However, his powerful central idea still remains relevant. As he declared, it is important to remember that while we want Western education, we do not want it to be at the expense of our identity or our culture. Over a 16-year period between 2006 and 2021, Indigenous students' enrolments at Australian universities grew by 152.6%. This second slide shows unequivocally how the annual growth rate in enrolments is significantly higher amongst Indigenous students in most years from 2007 to 2021. Universities are building a pipeline of high-performing Indigenous students to transition into staff roles. Between 2005 and 2021, the number of Indigenous PhD student enrolments has more than doubled to 766 students, and I'm really pleased that there are at least 10 of them here in this room. Even more impressively, enrolment in postgraduate degrees has more than quadrupled from 819 students to just under 4,000 students in 2021. Australia has 2 Indigenous higher education and research institutes. The Bachelor Institute was established as a small annex of Camilla College in the 1960s, before moving to the Bachelor Township in the Northern Territory in 1975. Indigenous students come to Bachelor as part of their life's learning journey. They bring with them their own knowledge, languages and cultures as a part of two-way education to further their educational experience. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra develops, preserves and provides access to a national collection of Indigenous culture and heritage, whilst also engaging with research and collaborative ventures. I'll argue that in this moment of generational change across higher education, with the Australian Universities Accord, it is an ideal moment to reconsider Uncle Era's idea of an Indigenous university. So the Australian Universities Accord is the first review of university education and research since 2008. The Accord panel is currently considering the future skills need, the learning and teaching, access and opportunity, research and innovation and international education. So they have a very broad remit. The panel's final report is due in December this year. The interim report came out in July and outlined some areas of immediate action and frames some further engagement over the next 6 months. It's quite important to get their bold ambition. They want to see 55% of Australians between the age of 25 to 34 by the year 2050 to have a university qualification. This requires an additional 300,000 Commonwealth-supported student places by 2035 and an additional 900,000 Commonwealth-supported places by 2050. They also argue that we need to also grow completions from our mature age students as they upskill, reskill, or even gain their first qualification over this ambitious period. What is so fundamentally important is that the panel's ambition can only be realised by substantial growth in participation from a broad range of groups who are currently underrepresented in university education. Around 60% of this growth will need to come from students from low SES backgrounds, from poor families. Around 53% from regional and remote areas, and about 11% will need to come from Indigenous Australian students. Now, data analysed by the Australian Productivity Commission in 2019 showed that even though there had been significant growth in the number of students attending university from disadvantaged backgrounds, some of these students were unlikely to succeed, up to 20%. So if we're going to achieve this, we need a new model for university funding. It costs more to recruit students from disadvantaged backgrounds. It costs more to enable them to complete, to support them to succeed. We have been very active in thinking about what that sort of model of funding should look like. It needs to go particularly to increase the funding for equity of access and equitable success. We need to support a model of funding that really has a focus on regional equity, on mission-based compacts, as well as building the sort of state-of-the-art buildings that you would expect for all students, not just students in more privileged parts of Australia, such as Melbourne and Sydney. Growing the number of Indigenous students in university education is important, but we actually must succeed to ensure that they are successful. Without successful outcomes, they do not get the experience for the career opportunities or indeed even the social mobility that a university degree might give them. We must do more to grow successful participation of Indigenous students, and we need to also consider the diversity of choice across different educational providers. This is possible if we start to think about university systems rather than just the university. And we think about the kind of ways in which university systems work to create a set of pathways that enable the greater diversity of choice. Like the Bachelor Institute of Australian, or the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which they need a strong future. They also should be thinking about creating other Indigenous-led university colleges or even non-university higher education providers like an Indigenous version of the Australian Film and Television School. Greater diversity of choice, greater pathways. Indigenous students get to choose the right pathway for their needs at their particular time in life. But I think it's even more profound than just creating diversity of choice. Indigenous leadership and knowledges must be at the centre of these university systems. In the words of the Accord panel, First Nations students' culture, knowledge, research and communities should be at the heart of Australia's university education. This is quite a profound challenge. An Indigenous university is more than just a strongly committed institution. It's more than bolting on. It's more like it's If Indigenous leadership and knowledge is built in rather than just bolted on, it requires more than just applying a Western educational and research knowledge framework to Indigenous challenges. Universities indeed need to cultivate an engagement with Indigenous Australians that leads to a reframing of Western knowledge. Reconsidering educational values to reconsider how we all understand ourselves as human beings. This is what it means to bring First Nations people and knowledge to the heart of the university endeavour. The opportunity is to create an intellectual environment in which Indigenous people and knowledge transforms Western thinking. By bringing together Indigenous leaders and knowledge with great research, we can create a great future. I had the privilege to lead the Close the Gap agreement for Australian governments, working with state and territory governments and Indigenous voices represented in the Coalition of Aboriginal Peak organisations. In 2020, that new agreement was signed, and it's the first time that Indigenous peoples who didn't work for government, who worked for the community sector, were at the decision-making table and signatories of a Commonwealth State agreement. The Coalition of Peaks represented Indigenous services from sectors such as justice, housing, childcare, employment and education. Working together, we brought the best research evidence and data to the table. But the Peaks challenged that data. They challenged the research in a very highly productive way. And I think I'm very proud of the fact that the agreement built on Indigenous capability and strengths to avoid a very narrow focus on Indigenous deficits. But we need to be bolder than thinking that universities are just there to close the gap in Indigenous outcomes or health outcomes or justice outcomes. Indigenous knowledges are indeed key to addressing the global challenges that we face globally over this century. Universities can foster Indigenous academic leadership and partnership with Indigenous communities can create not just local impact, but global impact. So in that sense, in my view, the Accord panel is a bit too modest in positioning Australian university sectors in terms of the global challenges we face following 2 centuries of northern-led globalisation, extractive capitalism, and a reliance on fossil fuels. Recent analysis of the global challenges by Professor Rivers Black identified 3 global challenges for the next 30 years. The need to rapidly escalate our global response to climate change. The need to globally address rising inequality, not just here in Australia, but across the globe. And the need to address rising global volatility. It is my view that Indigenous peoples and knowledges should underpin all elements of our response to these global challenges. Let me illustrate. In 2023, Mr. Justin Mohammed was appointed as Australia's inaugural ambassador to First Nations people. This creates Indigenous diplomacy as a focus in our foreign policy. Indigenous diplomacy is a very powerful contribution to addressing global and regional volatility, which is in part driven by the growing social inequality of Indigenous peoples and other tribal peoples, both here in our region and also in Africa, South America, and in Europe and Asia. Universities have the potential to amplify the impact of Indigenous diplomacy through continuing to strengthen our relationships with other universities, most particularly across the global south and more generally with other Indigenous populations. Universities foster the exchange of knowledge. They foster research and education that draws on the deep experience of Indigenous Australia in addressing inequality. Indigenous peoples in Australia have impacted on social inequality in quite meaningful ways. Consider the recent pandemic. During the pandemic, the number of cases of COVID-19 infection was greater for non-Indigenous Australians. For non-Indigenous Australians, it reversed the gap by a factor of 6. This impressive result was because governments early engaged with Indigenous leaders at a local and national level and Indigenous health organisations to drive the pandemic response within our communities. There were higher rates of severe infection, but that probably reflected the higher rates of pre-existing chronic disease. Universities should be able to foster that knowledge across the global south and actually the lessons we learned here in Australia, which are very different to what happens unfortunately in the USA and in South America over the period of the pandemic. Universities can also foster Indigenous leadership and draw on Indigenous knowledge to better understand our deep past and better equipped for us to understand the challenges in front of us in terms of climate change. Let me illustrate. Greg kind of alluded to this extraordinary piece of recent research that harnessed the disciplines of history, astronomy, archaeology, and has created a very new understanding of our world. Our colleagues here, Greg Lehman and Rivi Taylor from UTAS, collaborated with colleagues at the University of Melbourne. This is a story of an ancient oral tradition. Indigenous Australians have a rich and complex understandings about the stars and the celestial systems. In the 1830s, a Palawa elder spoke about a time when the star, Moini, was at the south celestial pole. He laid down spears in the sand and drew a few reference stars to triangulate its position. This greatly confused Europeans at the time. No southern star exists today. However, in contemporary science and astronomy, we understand what is called axial precession. That is the movement as the Earth rotates. It wobbles on its axis like a spinning top. This shifts the location of the celestial poles every 26,000 years. As the thousands of years pass by, the position of the night sky shifts. We now know through contemporary research that the star known as Canopus today, or Moine to the ancient Palawa, was at the southernmost point of the sky, lying just over 10 degrees from the south celestial pole. It appeared to always hover in the southern skies each night. This last occurred 14,000 years ago. That is one of the most ancient oral traditions on the globe. And it happens before, at the same time, the rising seas turned Lutcha, Tasmania, into an island, which we also have an oral history about. For those of us coming from the north, when George Augustus Robinson, how we got there, we said quite simply, we walked. We walked from the north down that land bridge that later disappeared as the seas rose. In Palawa tradition, we were the first human beings to identify the South Pole through the sky. What is even more profound, it was this Palawa tradition harnessed with science and humanities that has created new knowledge about our planet and our universe. It is no longer a distant aspiration to consider an Indigenous university where elders inhabit professorial roles, where traditional knowledge and ways of learning can be enhanced by emerging technologies, and where foundational beliefs inform the culture of the institution. One of my most significant moments in my academic career was in 2015, when the University of Melbourne conferred Dr. Yunupingu with an honorary Doctor of Laws in the ceremony grounds at Gama in northeast Arnhem. I had organised this ceremony event. I led the ceremony in a possum skin coat for the university, not wise, in northeast Arnhem at any time of the year. I watched Indigenous leaders and academics process past Yolngu ceremonial dances who are acknowledging the uncle in the traditions of the Yolngu and the ceremonies of the Yolngu. Academic robes with designs dating from medieval Europe contrasted exquisitely with Yolngu colours and designs. Tears flowed. They were absolutely flowing from toughened Indigenous academics like Marcia Langton, Jackie Huggins, from Noel Pearson. As we watch this profound moment, I think it was one of the most humbling moments that actually transcended time. It's that moment that the ancient Yolngu tradition, law and ceremony came together with a much younger medieval tradition of the university. And that was the first time when I truly understood the potential of the Indigenous University. I have only a glimpse of the vision that Japananga Errol West and other Indigenous educational leaders had over 30 years ago. At this time, at this moment in our global history, we can wait no more. We can wait no more. I'm the proud custodian of the vision of Japananga Errol West and the Indigenous educational activists who first put down the idea of an Indigenous university. I'm the product of it. I could not have become a medical doctor, a PhD graduate, and indeed a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at a university without that activism and without that momentum for change. I want to go on. I'm going to read a poem of Errol in conclusion. Before I do that, I just want to thank two people, Greg Lehman and Ollie Grant in my office, for actually helping. And Greg is such a profound scholar. He helped me actually quite a lot in preparation of this speech, so I too am indebted to him. But I want to share one of Errol's poems. It's a poem that it's a poem of pain, a pain of loss. Not that we lost our culture, but we lost our connections with some of that tradition. And I read that in this light because I think it is the perfect complement to this lecture and his idea of a university that brought together in a profound and transformative way Indigenous Australians, their knowledge and their culture into a contemporary Western educational university. There is no one to teach me the songs that bring the moonbird, the fish or any other things that make me what I am. No old woman to mend my spirit by preaching my culture to me. No man with the knowledge to paint my being. The spectre of the past is what dwells within. I search my memory of the early days to try and make my presence real, significant, and whole. I use my childhood memories of places, people, and words to recreate my identity. Uncle Leadham, a fine black man, is my fondest memory. He could sing, he could dance and play with the mouth organ or gum leaf. His broad shoulders carried me, and as I remember, I found it a great pleasure. I owe him and his contemporaries a debt, and I'll pay. But there is no one to teach me the songs that bring the moonbird, the fish, or the other things that make me who I am. Like dust blown across the plain, we are the people of the moonbird. Whitey said, "You'll be better over there, you'll grow again." Oh, how wrong he was. Why the graves of children run 4 deep, all victims of a foreign disease. They had no resistance to the legacy of the white invasion, or so they must have thought. I am their legacy, and I'll not disgrace them. But there is no one to teach me the songs that bring the moonbird, the fish, or any other thing that makes me what I am. Inside, a warrior of ages rises up. My soul he possesses, his righteous indignation is the cup from which I drink. I do not want blood, just the opportunity to be. But even with him, within there is no one to teach me the songs that bring the moonbird, the fish, or any other thing that makes me what I am. Although wretched the invaders were, for me they created a greater wretchedness, for they at least spoke their language, understood their role, yet it was nothing to be sought. My great-grandparents knew their culture, and it could not be taken from them. Through the minutes since this life is taken from me, though my warrior within says differently, even yet there is no one to teach me the songs that bring the moonbird, the fish, or any other thing that I am. Waranta, Tunapli, Waipa, Palawa, Jampanaka, Errol West, Rara, Takamana, Rara, Kani, Rara, Lini, Rana. Ulika, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I can't think of a better way to end a Japananga Errol West Memorial Lecture than with Errol's own words. I think he'd be very happy about that. Again, I'd just like to acknowledge members of Errol's family. It's also a wonderful thing to be able to have members of Errol's family with us tonight. And I'd also like to thank Uncle Anthony Egan, who has extended his respect and acknowledgement to the family, and in particular Errol's daughter Gillian, who he has family connections with, and wants to acknowledge the family from his country. We now have an opportunity for questions from the floor. And just while people are gathering their thoughts and coming up with a question, I'd just like to ask you, and I'm thinking back to those times in the early 90s when there were arguments and debates and some jockeying for position on the part of some powerful Indigenous scholars who were around at the time, who perhaps thought that that they should be the ones driving the vision for an Indigenous university rather than some of their colleagues. One of the big questions was, what would this Indigenous university look like? What would it physically be? I remember at the time, and this was quite visionary thinking back in the 1990s, if you think back to the time when the internet was only really in its infancy. There was a vision that it could be a virtual institution. It didn't need to have a physical home. There was another vision that was put forward, that an Indigenous university could exist as part of, or as a colleague or a partner with every other university in Australia. And it would be a place that students could elect to enrol in partnership with all other universities rather than in competition. I'm wondering, have you given any thought to the bricks and mortar, the nuts and bolts, the virtual nature of what an Indigenous university might be?
So I think it can be all those things, and probably needs to be all those things. So in New Zealand, there are Indigenous higher education institutions. There are also increasingly other in New Zealand universities are heading down the path of being treaty driven. So I think that all those possibilities should be explored. We can be in the world of digital education. There are many ways in which we can connect. I think that all Australian universities should be transformed by taking seriously the ability of working with First Nations peoples and knowledges. That transforms Western education. So we should be bold in terms of our vision. But I think there are other ways in which Indigenous-led institutions should be able to thrive. University colleges are not universities, but they are part of a university system. Non-university higher education providers are also, they can be smaller, they can be more agile, but they can be Indigenous run. We have enough Indigenous academics to actually do that nowadays. So the Australian Film and Television School is an example of a non-university higher education provider. So I don't think we need to be modest. I think we need to be bold, and I think we need to explore all those other opportunities. The Bachelor Institute in the Northern Territory is a very fine Indigenous institution. It suffers under the current ways in which it is funded today. So we move into a new funding environment, it should actually succeed. And it's right at the heart of the possibilities of preservation of some of the very old ancient ceremonial systems in Northern Australia and the Northern Territory. So I would say all those things are possible. We need to find the right fit, and we need to work with our communities to find the right fit, but don't be humble. Be bold. The world needs us to be bold, because if we are not bold, we are not going to transform the climate. We're not going to address global inequalities, or we're not going to address the things that trouble us most in this world. This is the time for us to step forward and to lead that change.
Thank you, Ian. There is a question that's come in online from Johnny that actually goes straight to one of the key points that you made just then about transforming Western education. And I'll read his question quite specifically. With 65,000 years of accumulated Aboriginal knowledge, why is it necessary to, quote, reframe Western knowledge in order to develop a curriculum for an Indigenous university?
I'm being very ambitious. I think what I was trying to say, particularly with that way in which we were talking about how Palawa tradition has reclaimed our understanding of the South Pole of the universe, is actually bringing together Palawa tradition with contemporary astronomy, with contemporary archaeology, in ways that were informed by our tradition, and bringing them together in a way that actually transformed our understanding of the world. That's not the only path. We should be fostering the development of our knowledges in their own right. We should be fostering the development of our own research potential in our own right, but we also should not think that we can sustain a global universe that is reliant on the set of knowledges that in part have contributed to the world in which we're living now.
Thank you, Ian. We'll go to a question from the floor.
G'day, Ian. It's Duncan here. I'm interested in the University of Australia interim report and talking about Indigenous students being the heartbeat, and also then in parallel with you talking about being bold. Do you think universities in Australia are ready for an uncomfortable conversation that comes from the heart of Indigenous students, and if they are ready to listen?
Well, if they don't, what is the consequence? If we don't, we're going to fail the globe. So I kind of say bring it on. I think we should be confident around that sort of stuff. We're not begging, we're not asking to be considered. We're saying we have something to offer. Now, it's not just here in Australia, that's happening across the globe. So I think particularly we should be more forthright and really say we need to transform. We need to transform together. We have such a powerful contribution to make to university education and research. And if you don't want to, if that's your path, you can go away, but we're going to be there and we're going to work together and we're going to transform. I don't actually know what the destination is. I just know that all I can see is that you get to something very special if you consider the ways in which our ancient knowledges have a contribution to make to education, to research.
We'll go to another question that's come in online from Angela. And is there a risk of an Aboriginal university standing alone being overrun by other universities utilising the obvious depth of cultural grounding that would be evident? Could we lose ourselves in this?
Yeah, and I think that's a real consideration, and we need to think about ways in which we can make sure that doesn't happen. So I don't think anything I'm saying about being bold is without risk. But we've risked a lot over the last 220 years, and we've lost a lot. But there is something to be said about being bold and being ambitious, but being alive to those sort of risks, stopping too far or going too fast, too quick. So I think that's actually what Uncle Errol West wanted. He wanted us to be bold. He was saying this at a time when there were no Aboriginal graduates from most universities in the country. So he had a bold vision. And all those other educational activists at that time had a bold vision. So I think we should honour them by taking up the opportunities that they created us.
Thank you, Anne. We'll go to another question from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your address, Ian, and for the food for thought you've given us. As one who grew up at Rocky Cape on the northwest coast, I know your beautiful land very well. And it was a lifestyle that gave me a very deep connection to the earth and to a spiritual aspect of life. When you said the Indigenous influences have the potential for global impact, the concept of an Indigenous university is absolutely fabulous, but we're increasingly becoming aware of the truth of the history in this nation, which has been quite horrific, and not least of all here in Tasmania. And the concept of a clash of cultures in 1788 certainly resonates with the knowledge I have, having lived and worked with Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, which raises the issue of the spiritual aspect and what the Indigenous people globally have to offer those of us who are from a Eurocentric background, and why this isn't being explored more fully through the university and through education, the education sector generally, but also as far as the Aboriginal communities. I hear very little about this area, and I'd like your comments, please.
So that's a very big question. I'm going to only be able to answer part of it. There's something to be said for the ways in which, and I'm talking about traditional knowledges here, the knowledges, how it connected all those things through spirituality. There wasn't a separate world, the spiritual world. There wasn't an economic world. There wasn't a world of kinship. They're all fundamentally related. So you could not know other people other than through being kin. In a traditional world, and in parts of Australia that is still the case. And more so, that had a very significant spiritual dimension. So I think that that's one of the other things that Aboriginal ways of knowing and being actually brings back into the equation, a kind of more fundamental way in which you connect your humanity with your spirituality and your ways of knowing the past.
We'll go to another online question from Graham. I'm interested in the idea of a systems thinking approach to the university sector as a whole. Alongside the idea of an Indigenous university, I'm prompted to suggest a multicultural university. Consider, for example, the insights that emerged from a collaboration between Western medicine and traditional Chinese medicine. Would an explicitly multicultural university be something to pursue in a university system? So I guess the question is, what's the difference between is there a difference between a multicultural university and an Indigenous university?
So most of my conversation tonight was really about Indigenous knowledges and people, but there needs to be a much more diversity in the university system anyway. If we're going to succeed and have more young people from the northwest coast come to university, then they'll come from a poor educational background. They won't have the educational opportunities. If they come from Glenorchy or Bridgewater, that is a factor we need to consider. So we can't be the same sort of universities that we were 30 or 40 years ago. We've got to cater for that diversity. We've got to protect people and enable them to flourish educationally within a much more enriched educational environment. My concern is really about Indigenous folks and Indigenous knowledges, but what we learn from doing that can be applied to a much broader range of people from a very much more diverse educational background.
Thank you, Anne. We'll go to a question from the audience. One of our visiting students from Monash.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Abe.
Latrobe, sorry.
Yes, I'm one of the students from Latrobe. And thank you. I think it was a fascinating lecture. I'm a Māori, and I can't help but think about Professor Linda Tuhuai-Smith and the critique that she made of academia and in particular structural racism within universities, which ultimately led to her departing the University of Waikato. And coming from Melbourne this week, I can't help but also think about Dr. Eddie Cabillo and the critique that has been made of the University of Melbourne Law School and his resignation. So I suppose my question is, I think it's really optimistic and wonderful that, you know, we're thinking about this, but also there are ways in which I think that the readiness of universities to really progress and embrace what we're talking about today may be a mirage. And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on some of the challenges that we have in addressing that ongoing racism within university.
And indeed we must. We can't get to what I was talking about unless we're actually prepared to have that conversation. And there are a multitude of ways in which Aboriginal folks encounter that in their everyday lived experience. We have to call it out. But we also can draw on our intellectual activism and the activism of that previous generation of people to keep that focus. You can't... there are a number of recent cases in New Zealand, actually, that go to that, particularly in the sciences. And I think that that's where I would commend you for your scholarship and commend you for your intellectual leadership, because in some ways that's probably the most powerful tool we have in front of us. But we've also got that older generation of activism that we can draw on and draw strength from. So I'm telling the optimistic side of the story, but exactly what you're saying is that we have the same vision. We need to actually address structural racism in our universities, and it's there. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. I'm looking
Professor
right
Andrews.
I'm looking right at Julie, and just giving her a welcome and an invitation to offer our final question for the evening.
Mine's more of a reflection statement on what the lecture's been about. Hillis Maris was my mother auntie. She's my mother's sister. And I was there when she used to talk about the university, Indigenous Aboriginal University, back in the 70s. And then she went on to set up Warrawa Aboriginal College in Victoria. But she also wrote Women of the Sun, the 4-part drama series about colonisation and how the impact taking away culture and our voice. But I remember when, and I met Errol as well, and all, you know, Colin Burke and that, they were our elders. You know, we call our elders now in a different way, but they were our elders that were exploring the future for us. And their knowledge, it wasn't recognised back then, but we didn't need it to be recognised. It was for us. And that's what they were talking about. They were exploring ways for our knowledge to grow and connect with, you know, cultures from across the world, as they were travelling then as well, across to other Indigenous cultures. So for that conversation to happen, it was because they were being blocked. But did we really need to be accepted by universities? That was the other thing, like you're saying, Ian, being bold. Do we really need universities to guide us and show us the way now? Maybe that's my question.
So I think you answered your question. I probably never want to contradict you, Julie Andrews, but I think that is the question for us. It's kind of an existential question about where we can harness the power of academic knowledge to actually create impact, both in our communities but globally. But I keep coming back to this. What we do in the university world is a benefit to all peoples. And that's where I think there is a particularly profound opportunity for you. But thank you for remembering Auntie Haas. Thank you for remembering all of those other gorgeous people who transformed our world.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to all of you in the audience, online and present here with us this evening. Unfortunately, that's it for the time that we have available. You can find these and upcoming events on the Island of Ideas website, and the link, I think, is now on the screen, and also information about our next event to be delivered by the Medical Director of General Practice and Primary Care in the Tasmanian Department of Health, Dr. Alison Turnock. Her talk, Does an Apple a Day Keep the Doctor Away?, is on 19th September at our Medical Science Precinct on our city campus, and also online. Please join Dr. Turnock for the annual Arthur Cobbold Memorial Lecture and consider how we can create a Tasmania where people feel healthier. And most particularly, find out why keeping the doctor away might not be the name of the game. So I invite you all to express your thanks and join me in expressing our great appreciation to Professor Ian Anderson for presenting the 2023 Errol Japananga West Memorial Lecture this evening. Thank you very much.